Okay, so I'm standing here with Chris Henschel of the Canadian Parks and Wilderness Society. Chris, I'm hoping you're going to explain LULUCF to us. What does this acronym mean?
Well, it means land use change, and forestry, but just to make it simple, all your viewers need to know what we've been talking about here is emissions from forestry, emissions from logging. So it's really what it's about is developed countries and whether they need to account for emissions from their logging activities.
Okay, and what's the good news about LULUCF and what's the bad news about it?
Well, there is no good news. It's all bad news. And what we know is that these negotiations are tracking towards developed countries getting developing countries to agree to let them increase their emissions from logging, not account for it. So they're going to pretend it never happened. And the effect of that is about 500 megatons per year that they're going to be emitting into the atmosphere. More emissions from logging than in the past. They're not going to account for them. What that means is when we need to actually be reducing emissions from climate change, developed countries in the logging sector will actually be doing the reverse, and they're looking to get a get out of jail free card.
So what needs to change in order to make these regulations work?
We need developed countries to take responsibility for their logging emissions. We've been saying for over a year now that simply what they need to do is account for any increase in emissions. I mean, ideally they need to be reducing emissions. They're not willing to do that. We need them to fully account for those emissions so that we know what's happening and that it's reflected in the country's overall performance to reduce emissions, so we know what's really going on. Because right now what they're saying is we don't want to account for this increase because it's too politically difficult to do so. Essentially, they don't want to admit it to anyone. So we want them to be honest. We want them to account for any changes in emissions from logging, and what that means is it creates pressure to reduce those emissions. So that's what we're looking for.
Okay, and both at these talks in Tianjin, China, and also at the previous round of talks in Bonn in Germany, we've heard a lot about loopholes, and I guess I know it's quite complicated, but what are these loopholes? How are the rich countries trying to get through this regulation without accounting for their emissions?
Well, basically what they're doing is they're saying that they're planning on increasing their emissions, as I said, and they said we're going to measure our performance against what's happening in the future. So we're planning on increasing our emissions, and we'll measure our performance against this plan to increase emissions, so we're going to look fine. Whereas, everyone else talks about what were emissions in 1990 or what are emissions now, and reducing them from what they are now so we can reach our targets of limiting dangerous climate change. They're saying instead, as sort of a procedural sleight of hand, they're saying, well, okay, we're not going to increase our emissions compared to the future when they're going to be higher anyway. So, I mean, it's really quite ridiculous. But because it's a fairly technical discussion, a lot of people don't know what it is or what's going on. It seems to be slipping under the radar.
Okay, so what should we hope for in Cancun, the major climate talks coming up at the end of this year, or in South Africa next year? You've said it's not good news so far. Where are we going to find the good news?
What we can hope for is leadership from the EU, from Australia, from Canada, from New Zealand, Japan, all these countries that could take leadership and actually, I mean, leadership in this case means simple responsibility and accountability. We need them to step up and throw this approach out, and we need developing countries to demand more, because right now it looks like developing countries are ready to accept this bad deal just to get on with things. They're so frustrated by how long it's taking. Developed countries won't talk about other important issues because they want to get this one done. They're basically holding developing countries hostage. So we need some leadership from the developed countries, and we need developing countries to ask for more in Cancun.
Chris, thanks very much for joining us. It's a really clear explanation, and maybe we'll catch up with you in Cancun, hopefully with some better news.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.